Thinking about audiences tonight, what's their role? Do they matter? Chewing over the effects of lockdown. Mary Beard, Inside Culture at 7. But now, Jo Coburn and Politics Live.
It's Thursday, it's 12:15 and we're live in Westminster. Joining me today, very soon, Conservative MP and Chair of the Women and Equalities Committee, Caroline Nokes. Shadow Culture Minister Alison McGovern. Writer and commentator Inaya Folarin-Imam. And Professor of Black Studies at Birmingham City University, Kahinda Andrews. Today, the government say they will force arrivals from high-risk countries to quarantine in hotels. But when?
I think the Prime Minister was saying within days, but if he said...
No, he said
day,
it would be today. He said it would be today.
Well, my understanding is it was always going to be within the next few days.
10 million jabs here, but are poorer countries getting their fair share?
I need to be blunt. The world is on the brink of a catastrophic moral failure.
I think it's time we stopped our cringing embarrassment about our history and we stopped this general bout of self-recrimination and wetness.
We'll ask this Professor of Black Studies if he agrees with the Prime Minister. Let's start today's show with Chris Whitty, the Chief Medical Officer, and something he said yesterday at the Downing Street briefing. Here he is.
Yes, I think that most of my colleagues think we are past the peak. Now, that doesn't mean you could never have another peak, but at this point in time, provided people continue to follow the guidelines, we're on the downward slope of cases of hospitalisations and of deaths in all four of the nations of the United Kingdom. So I think we do think at this point, this peak at least, we are past.
So, my opening question to all of you is, did that feel like a moment? Alison, with you first of all, what did you feel and how did you react when you heard Chris Whitty talk about we're past the peak? Time to ease restrictions or hunker down?
You know, I think that we're all a bit... It's not that we're not looking for moments anymore, but I think we've been through a lot as a country, and I think that all of us are a bit wary, I think, for banking too much good news at the moment. I think that the bigger picture is about making sure that the vaccine programme really works. And I think that's probably where I feel most hopeful, rather than focusing on individual moments.
Caroline, what about you? What did you think when you heard we're past the peak, Chris Whitty?
Well, I think that's good news, but we have to be extremely cautious. The priority has always been about making sure that people are safe. So I really welcome the progress we're making with the vaccine rollout, over 10 million doses so far. And I think it's about making sure that any plans that come forward to reopen the economy are done safely, cautiously. It would be, I think, foolhardy, having come this far for so long, to rush into opening everything up too quickly.
Inaya?
Yeah, I would probably echo what's already been said. I think, whether that was the first lockdown or the kind of second one, we have had many moments of hope, but fundamentally people have sacrificed a lot. And now a year later, many people are very weary of these kinds of statements. And then my banking very much is on the vaccination program as well. I think that's really when that is, maximised, will be the point where we can really think about securely how we can open up the country again.
Kahinda, how did you react when you heard it?
Well, I mean, we've been here before, right? A year later, we're still in lockdown and we've been past the peak before. And I think it's just a reminder that, we have to be extremely careful with this, and opening up the economy and people's individual freedom to go buy coffee isn't more important than actually saving lives. So hopefully we don't do what we've seen happen before, is this quick rush to open the economy, and we actually be sensible about people's lives.
Right, well, you mentioned the economy. I just want to ask you about this in the Daily Telegraph. We're showing our viewers the headline. Rishi Sunak concerned scientists are moving goalposts on lockdown. The Treasury deny it, but Caroline, are you concerned, as the Chancellor reportedly is, that the scientists are moving the goalposts on ending lockdown?
Well, I don't think that's the case, and I don't think that there is any split between the Treasury and the rest of government. I think everybody is united in wanting to see lockdown relaxed when it's safe to do so.
Right. I mean, Alison, there have been denials, as I just said, from the Treasury, but you can hardly blame officials there for being restless. I mean, in the end, they are the ones financing lockdown, however long it lasts.
Well, actually, I think that the Tories in general have had this wrong from the beginning. I think that they've pitted economic interests and public health interests against each other, and that's completely wrong. I think loads of economists outside government would say that the public health imperative is absolutely crucial for our economy. You know, if your workforce is sick, you ain't going to be very productive. And I think that's a fundamental mistake that the Tories have made from the word go. And all of the public health measures are needed for our economy right now and in the medium term, because we need a healthy population that is able to, you know, be more productive and give our country a strong future.
All right. Well, people may be baffled that despite endless talk over the past week or so by the government of a targeted hotel quarantine policy, it's still not in place and hasn't happened. And that is underlined by this response from Rob Patterson from the Best Western Group of Hotels. Let's listen to him.
We got the understanding that quarantine hotels was something that was going to be considered in the UK, you know, quite some time ago now, and we're yet to understand exactly what the protocols are required of the hotels. We've set out a set of protocols, we've shared that information or suggested protocols, and we've offered our support, and we're yet to hear anything.
Right. I mean, Caroline, you're a former immigration minister. You know the ins and outs of border policy. We've had the South African variant was first detected in the UK 6 weeks ago. 2 weeks ago, Sage advised the government about the risks of not closing UK borders. A week after that, the government announced its policy of targeted hotel quarantine. And yet, still, today we're expecting a statement. It's not happening. What's the problem?
Well, we are expecting a statement, and I think it would be wrong of me to try to prejudge what's going to be in that. But it's important to remember that 40% of our freight comes in underneath passenger aircraft in the body of the aeroplane. So if you cancel all passenger travel in and out of the UK, what you will see is a failure of medicines, for example, to get through essential equipment that we need in the UK. So any measures that come forward have to be very carefully thought out. We know that there are only 10,000 hotel beds in the immediate Heathrow area. So you'd then be looking at the fact that we have about 20,000 passengers coming in per day. So it's very complicated. And I think it would be wrong to rush into this at this point.
Well, no, I mean, there's certainly no rushing.
The Health Secretary...
Well, that might be a sort of overstatement or an understatement, whichever way you're looking at it. But, I mean, there certainly isn't a rush on this, is there? I mean, we understood that there would be a statement today, and it seems to have changed. I mean, how difficult can it be in that sense? How many ministers does it take to book hotel rooms?
Well, I'm no longer a minister and I can't comment on what discussions, what negotiations are going on. But I think it's right that we act to do something. And I'm looking forward to whatever it is that the Health Secretary comes out with in due course.
Right. Alison, would Labour have done a better job?
Well, you've got to expect me to say yes on every occasion to that question, haven't you, really? But I think, I mean, I've long had worries, even, you know, beyond COVID about our borders. I mean, the cuts under Osborne actually had an impact, I think, on this. But to talk about this specific issue, which is really, really important, we know that the current isolation system isn't really working because we are not making sure that all of those people who should be isolating as they cross the border, we know that system to make sure that is happening isn't really working. So, Joe, you're right to indicate that we need speed on this. And, you know, we'll all look forward to what is said in the statement. But I suppose people would forgive us for being anxious that we get this right. Right. Because nobody wants to undermine the current vaccine programme. Nobody wants to, you know, see us go backwards.
All right. I mean, Kinder, it is complicated, though. You heard Caroline outline some of the logistical problems. Do you have some sympathy with the government?
No, I mean, this is a year later. I mean, talking about rush, I mean, this is not new, it's not a surprise. And again, it's just one of those other examples where the scientists have made very clear about travel, clear about don't open universities, clear about don't reduce lockdown before Christmas. And the government just ignores it. I mean, the government has blood on its hands. And this is just another example of them bungling the response, which is why there are so many deaths and so disproportionately so many deaths in the UK.
Caroline?
Well, I don't think that it's fair to blame everything on quarantine not having happened yet. We have a range of measures. The scientists have been really clear. There is no silver bullet. No single measure is going to stop the spread of COVID. So we have to take measures that people don't like. Nobody likes to be told to quarantine in their own home. People don't like to be told that they can't go on holiday. But it's about making sure that we do this in a proportionate way and listening to the advice as best we can.
Inaya?
Yeah, I'd probably kind of agree with Caroline. Ultimately, Chris Whitty has said that we are probably past the peak. So it's clear that this measure may not necessarily have been a kind of fundamental difference in terms of the kind of cases. And it has been a year later. Many people did think that the government should have been tougher when it came to borders. But ultimately, we have a massively expanded vaccination program now, and we are past the peak. And so the other measures that are being taken are also clearly having an impact in a positive direction.
Right. I mean, is it really practical, though, to close the borders in that definitive way, Alison and Kahinda? It's not just freight. People do have to travel for other reasons. And there is a sense that it is a rather draconian way to behave, to completely close off in the way countries like New Zealand have. Alison?
There will be exceptions. I mean, there will be examples where that wouldn't be appropriate, and I would expect any responsible government to have a policy for that. I think the point is that we need a comprehensive set of policies that can make sure that we take the best possible epidemiology and apply that to the situation we face. And therefore, my instinct is to be led by the SAGE advice on this, and this is, they think this is important for the effort. As I said before, I've got general concerns about some of the efficacy of the measures, and I think it's important that we as the opposition do challenge the government and do hold them to account for that, because hopefully that improves the situation for everybody.
Right.
You have to look across the measures, understand what the epidemiology is telling us, which is a fast-moving question, and try and respond in the best way that you can, and that's what we expect the government to do.
But Kahinda, is it right to put up the barricades? Is it right to sort of force nation states to close themselves inward in this way?
Well, I actually think this is one of the times the Tory government surprised me, because given their actual immigration policy, the opportunity to close the borders, you think they'd have been delighted. But I think that what you can see is that other countries have done this. It's clearly a measure where you want to stop travel. Again, clearly, this is the evidence of the scientists saying this, and they've been saying this for a very long time. So sure, it's complicated, but this didn't just happen last month. It's been happening for a year. This has been a problem which has been going on and on.
Oh.
And to say that we're at past the peak and we've got the vaccines, 100,000 people have died, and there's a big chunk of that's needless because of this government's inaction on borders, on track and trace, on lockdown. And you can't just say, well, now it's all going to end happily. So we just forget the fact that 100,000 people are dead.
Well, let me pose a slightly different question to you, which is, would the issue of closing the borders or not be less of a problem if vaccines were being distributed more equitably around the world? That would reduce the risk of new variants coming into the country, which might be imported to the UK. Let's have a listen to the head of the WHO, the World Health Organization.
I need to be blunt. The world is on the brink of a catastrophic moral failure. And the price of this failure will be paid with lives and livelihoods in the world's poorest countries.
Caroline, the latest figures show 145 countries will benefit in the first phase of the global vaccine rollout, but they can expect only 3% of their populations to be vaccinated by the summer. Now, we've already vaccinated 15% of our population, 10 million jabs, and it's only February. Is that fair?
Well, we're the largest donor to COVAX, which has secured over 600 million doses of vaccines for developing countries. I think it's absolutely crucial that we all recognise the importance of making sure that the vaccine is available as widely as possible. And the UK is playing its part. We're the biggest donor to COVAX, the biggest donor to Gavi, doing some amazing work. And we heard very recently that the US is now going to join COVAX, which again is excellent news. But it's important that we make sure that we are working globally. And I think the UK, with the incredible financial contributions it's made, £500 million to COVAX, is playing its role in this.
Right. Well, Alison, would you like to see more of our vaccines being diverted to perhaps poorer parts of the world?
Well, I listened to what Caroline says, and I'm reminded that for a long time there was a solid consensus across all parties in the House of Commons, that our reputation internationally on aid and on, assisting other countries in a cooperative way, working alongside them to meet the challenge where we have, intense poverty, and for the UK to have a positive role. That view was really shared, and I worry that it's fracturing at the moment. So, of course, it's in our interests for the vaccine programme to be global, because, it's obvious, isn't it? This virus has spread globally, and therefore the programme must be global, and we should play a role in that. I worry that consensus about the UK's role in the world is no longer what it was in Westminster, and I hope that we can, through this crisis, maintain that approach of cooperation with other countries.
Caroline?
Well, I think we are playing our role in both COVAX and Gavi, as I said. I think there is an enormous piece of work to be done, making sure that globally every other country is also joining. It's great news that the US is now on board. But I've been quite outspoken on my thoughts on international aid, as I'm sure Alison knows. I think it's crucially important when it comes to the education of girls globally that the UK plays its part. I'm chair of a select committee that is there to defend the rights of women. And I think it's really important that we think very closely, recognising that the UK economy has shrunk anyway. So any reduction from the 0.7, it's going to be a smaller total in the first place. And so I think it's crucially important that we work together globally, whether it comes to vaccines, whether it comes to international aid. And as Alison will know, I'm always very happy to work cross-party on issues like this.
Right. I mean, Kahinda, is it hardly surprising that countries are putting their own populations first when it comes to vaccination?
Well, this whole vaccination thing just shows you the problem with the world today, right? We have this illness. Look how quickly this vaccine has come about. I mean, because it's affected us here, because we've been able to put so much money in, you've got illnesses like malaria, which have been around for hundreds of years and kill hundreds of thousands of children a year, and there's no vaccine for that. But very quickly, this miraculous vaccine has turned up. And then you've seen the rich countries, which just coincidentally happen to be the countries, Western white countries, have monopolized the vaccine, you're talking about our vaccines and can we help these poor and underprivileged people in the world? But just look at the imbalances that this has shown. The vaccine in the first place, the access to the vaccine, Britain and America and the West buying up all these vaccines with very little regard for other parts of the world. It just shows you that some lives matter far more than others.
Inaya?
Well, I think, I absolutely agree that countries with the broadest shoulders should contribute more. But I do think that Britain has been playing a significant part, whether that is being a significant investor in COVAX or leading the way in global research. But absolutely, I think we've also heard calls of if there are kind of excess vaccinations and people calling for it to be shared. And it's a global pandemic, and I think there is a lot of solidarity around the world in kind of supporting other countries. But ultimately, the politicians in our country are kind of democratically accountable to the people here. And we have also heard that we've had a very significant death toll. And ultimately, people would hope that the kind of primary job of decision makers is to ensure that the people in this country, the citizens here, are protected. That doesn't mean that we don't play a leading role in shoring up and supporting people around the world. But we do live in a kind of world of inequality. That's an unfortunate reality, and we can play our part in contributing to doing more. But I don't think racializing the situation and kind of pitting countries against each other is how we build solidarity in these really difficult times.
Kahinda, you were shaking your head during that.
Well, it's not just coincidental that Britain and America and Europe has the money to do this. It's not just, that's not a coincidence. That is by design. That just shows you, for example, the real biggest pandemic every year is actually poverty, which kills about 9 million people, most of which are black and brown. So what's been shown here is, I'm not racializing this. This is a racialized issue where some countries are richer and some countries are poorer, and some countries have access to vaccines and some countries don't. But that follows the very same logics of racism, which we've seen actually in the way that the illness is affecting people even in this country, if you look at the disproportionate death rates. So it's clearly an issue which is racialized from the top to the bottom.
Alison?
Well, I think that you can't deny the structural inequalities in our country or in the world, and I think you've got to understand that, and the pandemic has shown that in sharp relief, and it's really important that we understand that context.
Right.
I suppose my frustration and the conversation slightly differently that Caroline and I were having is that whilst she's right, there are people in the Conservative Party that understood the practical things that Britain can do to make that cooperation amongst countries that we would all want real. I worry that too many in the Conservative Party are now pulling away from that, and they ought not to be, because it's about having effective cooperative relationships with countries in the world.
Right. Well, you're worrying about the Conservative Party, and I'll ask Caroline in just a moment. But within the Labour Party, are there calls to divert a bigger proportion of the vaccines that we have here to poorer parts of the world to address that inequity that you've just talked about and said there are structural problems? What's the solution?
The solution is for the UK to use its expertise that was built up through the Department of International Development, to use its expertise in practical terms to help country governments that we have strong relationships with around the world to be part of COVAX, as has been described. But also, we have a really good set of civil servants who understand how to strengthen health systems, which is sort of a techie way of saying making all kinds of bits of health systems work well because of our understanding of the NHS. And it's to do all of those practical things to help other countries through COVAX and through that broader health systems approach to make sure that poor countries get the benefit of a partnership with the UK that can help them have the best possible health system.
Kahinda, are you satisfied by that response from Labour?
I mean, it's better than nothing, I guess. But I think this is one of those issues where it does show you that, look, we're in a situation where obviously you've got to try and vaccinate as many people as possible. And we're in this privileged position in the West to be able to do this and to buy up all these vaccines. Where there is a responsibility. There is a literal moral responsibility to make sure these vaccines are around the world, because we are in this position because those countries are poor and don't have access.
Yeah, I understand that. But what's your solution at the moment now, sitting here as we're in the middle of a pandemic? Would you like to see some of our vaccines diverted?
I think we should stop calling them our vaccines. I think this is the problem. We say our vaccines.
Well, UK vaccines.
I think you see all these stories. I saw another story a day with 60 million this vaccine, 60 million of that vaccine. At some point, we have enough vaccines. So maybe we should stop buying up all the vaccines and make sure there is true global cooperation where we're actually planning. Yes, there's a responsibility for the UK population, but I think we can manage that, and we should be thinking much more globally about how do we actually protect the world.
Right, there is another aspect, Kahinda, which is the UK has an older and therefore arguably more vulnerable population than many countries in the developing world. And with Europe and North America, as you said, recording far more COVID deaths than we know about in Africa and Asia. So it's not simply selfishness in that sense.
Well, yeah, I mean, again, I think when you start to say, well, where we buying up all these vaccines and we're saying our vaccine, I think it is selfishness. But actually, the fact that there is an older population here, again, shows you the inequality. Fortunately, the average population for Africa is like 60. So fewer people over the age of 60 because people die a lot earlier. So actually, we shouldn't really be celebrating that. That's an example of the inequalities which exist in the world.
Right. Inaya?
Yeah, no, I don't disagree necessarily with the reality of the fact that there are kind of deep structural inequalities that exist and persist internationally. I guess the question is, what can we do about that realistically? I think kind of some of the solutions that are proposed, for example, as far as I'm aware, Kehinde thinks that people should unite in a kind of Pan-African state, and kind of ethnic minority people go back to what he might regard as the homeland. I think necessarily in a kind of situation in a pandemic, that's not the kinds of solutions that are kind of practical to deal with the genuine material issues that people are experiencing right now. And I think some of those solutions is, for example, with Britain being an economically broad country, pioneering research. And I do agree that perhaps if we do have excess, we should be diverting it. This is a global pandemic, and there perhaps may be a situation at some point where other people may need things and we're able to provide that. Right. We should have that role.
OK, well, this is a good point, I think, to bring up Kahinda's book. We'll show everyone the front cover, The New Age of Empire, How Racism and Colonialism, I should say, Still Rule the World. Explain a little bit about the book for us, Kahinda.
Well, the whole point is really to explain how we've got into this situation where, as I said before, poverty is the real pandemic. 9 million people per year die. And actually, the lockdown is going to increase that number. And those 9 million people are generally in the underdeveloped world. If you look at COVID, you've seen the disproportionate death rates of Black and minority ethnic groups in the UK and in America, etc. We just had the Black Lives Matter Summer, which is all about the killing of George Floyd and people protesting police brutality. So very clearly, you can see that racism, white supremacy still is with us, still exists. And while the forms may have changed, so we're not in chains anymore, it's not direct slavery, it's not direct colonialism, the actual logic that black and brown life is worth less is still very, very much with us and very much shaping the social world today.
Right, and you mentioned the death of George Floyd and the subsequent Black Lives Matter protests. Are you encouraged that there is now a sustainable movement for change?
Well, I don't know. It depends what you mean by a sustainable movement for change, because this is not new, right? We've seen these kind of protests before, in the UK, certainly, just recently with Black Lives Matter, but certainly over the last 50 years. Sustained progress means actually understanding just how deep-seated these issues are. You know, we treat racism generally as though, you know, Donald Trump's bad and now he's gone, Biden's better, and things are going to improve. It's this kind of individual prejudice that we can teach out or legislate out. And unfortunately, we're still doing that. And that isn't the issue. Actually, issues of racism are these issues of vaccines, are these issues of structural inequalities. And unfortunately, I don't think we're really addressing them even now.
Right. So what's your solution?
What's the solution? The solution is that there's a number of ways to think about the solution. So one of them is we have to really understand what the problem is. So in the book, there's a lot of time actually talking about the framework of knowledge that we have. I work in universities, right? So I have a lot of experience with this. And the world can only be as equal as the knowledge that it's built upon. And unfortunately, our knowledge is deeply unequal and actually kind of embeds this idea that we should be at the top, the West should be at the top, the British should be better. So you actually have to go back and undo a lot of that stuff. And the other solution.
OK, so hang on, let me just stop you there. You want to go back and undo a lot of this stuff. What does that mean to you, Caroline, when you hear this? Kahinda saying racism and colonialism still rule today, and Kahinda is suggesting we go back and undo all this stuff. What's your response?
Well, I'm not entirely sure what he means by undoing, but certainly my committee in the inquiry that we launched into the impact of COVID on BAME people exposed yet again the structural inequalities that exist. And I have been quite outspoken on this and saying, look, it's all very well the government collecting endless data, but we need to have action. We need to address the housing issues, the fact that BAME people were more likely to be in insecure employment, that they were more likely to be in roles where they were exposed to the dangers of COVID, in shared accommodation, multiple occupancy housing. So a whole range of issues that the government really needs to get a grip on, and my committee was very clear in the report that we published on that. But when you're looking at knowledge and education, yesterday we heard from Hackney Borough Council about the brilliant work they're doing embedding a diverse curriculum. And it's actually crucially important that we start in schools and make sure that diversity is celebrated, encouraged, and not just, and I always say this, not just in Black History Month. It isn't good enough to focus on one particular part of the curriculum on 1 month of the year. It has to be across the whole curriculum and across 12 months of the year, or we will continue to see the sorts of inequalities that unfortunately are still prevalent today.
Inai, do you agree?
Well, I think that I think kind of narratives about racism deeply embedded and kind of fundamentally the kind of bedrock of our society is the kinds of narrative that I think breeds the sense of resentment and alienation, and it's not the kind of perspective that I think encourages ethnic minority people from whatever background to feel full participants of our society. Now, absolutely, there is still more to be done, and as has already been alluded to, the disproportionate impact of COVID on some ethnic minority communities absolutely should be analysed and understood, so we don't have any situation like that again. But I think that we should be doing that with a more evidence-led approach than necessarily a pre-existing narrative of systemic racism, which I think kind of Kahinda alludes to. And actually, according to a lot of research and surveys, most ethnic minority people absolutely feel like they belong in this country, that this is a country that they're proud to be a part of and want to shape it in a kind of positive way, and don't necessarily see themselves or the society as in opposition to that. And I think that's a very positive thing, that in our multi-ethnic and diverse society, we should be celebrating that, but with the lens of actually having a positive, unifying vision of Britain, not one that sees it in opposition to its ethnic minority populations.
Kahinda?
Well, I mean, 60% of the population think the British Empire was a force for good. So I don't think taking out a poll and saying, look, because people feel that they should belong means anything. Because people want to belong. But the fact is the reality. The reality is that you can find these deep-seated inequalities across all levels of society. And you have to really address that. So let's take the issue of COVID. And if you take the issue of it's inner cities, it's about the jobs people have. That's an economic imbalance. And that economic imbalance comes from somewhere. My family is descended from the enslaved. There is a huge black and white wealth gap, which goes back to that point. Up until 2015, the British taxpayers were paying back the reparations paid to slave owners 150 years ago, because the money to bail out the slave owners was so big it took almost 200 years for the government to pay it back. Whereas those who were formerly enslaved received nothing, which explains why there's poverty in the Caribbean, which explains why African Caribbean families today are still in issues of poverty and having these structural issues. When we say that we have to undo this stuff, that's a very simple thing to undo today. It's about money, it's about wealth, it's about reparatory justice. We're not having that conversation because we still relegate racism to I don't like this person, doesn't like this person in the pub.
Inaya?
Well, again, so, Kehinde picked some statistics. I could also do the same. One of the wealthiest kind of ethnic group in this country in terms of household income is kind of British Chinese and British Indians, British Nigerian kids and also adults are doing very well economically. So I think it's a very mixed picture. And I think that kind of selectively picking things to kind of paint a particular narrative about Britain as a fundamentally kind of racist society without necessarily providing any solutions meaningfully and how we kind of materially improve that just feels kind of ideologically driven. And I think that, I think in this kind of trying times, very, very difficult time, I think we need real practical solutions to deal with these deep-seated inequalities.
Kehinde?
Well, actually, that's not true. So the wealth gap is not British African households are not the wealthiest. Neither are Chinese. Is actually untrue. The wealth gap is a huge problem for ethnic minority groups. And if you look at the evidence, and I've given you statistics here. Look at wealth. Look at COVID. Look at education. Which education is a bit more mixed, but look at university education, not mixed at all. White students do significantly better than non-white students, and in the job market. This is evidence-based. The evidence of white supremacy is all around us. Look globally. This is not about ideology at all. And I gave you a very clear, concrete thing: reparations. I mean, there's reparations campaigns currently happening in the UK, in the Caribbean, has been in Africa. So it's very clear things. But when we talk about things which will hurt, which will actually make us uncomfortable, we say, oh no, that's too much, that's not realistic. But if we're not willing to do those, there's no point in having this conversation.
All right. Well, we're going to move on in just a moment. But first of all, I just want to show our viewers this headline in the Daily Telegraph. Inaya, the Black Lives Matter movement has turned up pressure on all areas of UK society to confront a colonial legacy. Today, the story is Captain Cook statues under threat as Black Lives Matter campaigners add genocidal explorer to hit list. Can I just get your reaction to that? Should they be taken down, Inaya?
Well, I think that, I think when it comes to any public monument, I think that should be done in a kind of democratic process, consulting a range of different voices and coming to a conclusion that way. I don't think that we should just, in a kind of reaction to a particular heated moment, follow the kind of loudest voices necessarily when it comes to these kinds of responses. That's a democratic decision that should be taken with consultation of a range of perspectives.
Kehinde?
Well, if you want a anti-racist public space, then it's probably best not to have slave traders and genocidal murderers. I would suggest you would want to take them down. But the reality is taking down those kind of statues doesn't actually change the situation. So if all we're going to do, it's relatively easy to, let's take down these statues, but actually not deal with the problem, then you may as well leave the statues up because that is the people that you're celebrating.
Are these things important, Alison, in terms of what they mean, issues around statues of slave traders?
Oh, I think public art is really important. And here in Merseyside, we've had a really good discussion and, we have an incredible International Slavery Museum that at the moment we're talking about expanding. And I only wish that it was able to be open soon and that you could all come and visit it and see why it does need to be expanded so that we can tell the full story of our history, because I think that's what we need to do. Of course, there will be discussion about individual statues and works of art. That's right. That's what art is there for, to be debated. And, we should know fully about all aspects of our history. All right. But I think that the important thing is empower those working in our museums to do what they want to do, which is to understand their history of their own collections and to tell that story in a thoughtful and reflective way with the involvement of all communities and the public.
All right, well, let's talk a little bit more about identity and how important it has become in terms of political debate, because this week The Guardian has revealed that the Labour leadership is looking at embracing a flag and patriotism strategy to connect with the party's former Red Wall voters. Yesterday, Luke Pollard, a shadow cabinet member, was talking about his response to that.
I'm personally in favour of more flags that reflect the fact that I can both be proud to be from Plymouth, from Devon, from England, from Britain, and proud to be part of a bigger European family.
Right, is that the right approach, Kahinda?
No, I mean, I think it's not. We shouldn't really be surprised that Labour is kind of leaning into this kind of patriotism. We kind of give Labour a pass because they've been a bit better on issues of racism. But my family came to this country under social democracy, and you had colour bars which were just as bad under Labour as they were under the Tories. The issue here is that what's happened is that racism has become good to sell votes. Like if you look at the Northern Wall, if you look at why working class voters have some working class voters have been seduced by the Tory policy, which is terrible for them. It's because essentially the Tories have blamed immigrants for the problems of the rich, right? You can't get hospital places because we don't invest in NHS, but actually this is about immigration and migrants. And it's electoral. It leads to electoral success. So I'm not surprised that Labour are going down that path, and it's a path they've been down before.
Alison?
Well, just to turn to the leak issue, did we really need, do we need leaks to think that the Labour Party might want to take Conservative MPs seats off them? That's sort of, what we're supposed to be about.
But it's about how, I think, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think that what Luke explains is that identity is multifaceted, it's complicated, but I see that as a separate thing from patriotism, which is not about, we shouldn't be about, adopting the successes of people who've gone before us in our history. We should be about our public service now. And that's, sometimes it's better to show, how you feel about your country than to focus on the words or symbols that we use. But, personally speaking, I don't think anybody should be surprised that the Labour Party thinks that its purpose is to serve the country, and that means patriotism.
Right. I mean, one Labour backbencher, Clive Lewis, had this to say about the Labour leadership reportedly wanting to wrap itself in the flag. He said, phony flag waving is not the way for Labour to win back the red wall. Do you agree with Clive, Alison?
Yeah, I think that phony anything is not good in politics. But again, if we want to talk about patriotism, let's talk about what we mean by that. And what I think we should mean by that is acting in service of the country. So dealing with some of the inequalities that we've been talking about, actually understanding what the kind of future is that will mean that everybody can have a good chance and an opportunity, no matter what their background, and addressing, some of the structural stuff that holds people back. That's the kind of patriotism where I think it's better to show it and to enable people to connect with how we feel about the country. We had a terrible electoral result last December, and it's understandable that we would try and think quite hard about how to move forward. But what I don't think anybody should question is the simple value that we all share in the Labour Party, which is about serving our country.
All right, we're going to move on to something else. But first of all, I just want to show everyone this story in The Sun. It was reported yesterday. Keir loses it is the headline. Sir Keir Starmer and Boris Johnson in fiery Commons bust-up as Labour leader has a meltdown after PMQ's jabs clash. Let's listen to the Labour leader's response today.
In PMQs yesterday, the Prime Minister was attacking me in relation to an issue. I misheard him and I got it wrong. And I think it's very important for politicians when they get it wrong to say, look, I got it wrong, it was a mistake, rather than to argue about it. So hands up, I was wrong about that. And that's why I said straight away, look, I'm wrong.
And what happened afterwards?
Oh, nothing. We had a discussion on the way out. But as I say, I was wrong about, I had misheard what the Prime Minister was putting to me. I was wrong about that. And as I say, hands up, wrong. Better to say that and just be straight about it.
So hands up and wrong. But Alison, is he rattled?
I don't think so, no. I mean, I've seen Keir in very, very stressful situations, and he is somebody who is calm under pressure as far as I've seen. I won't repeat the slightly after the watershed description of some of the reporting of this issue that from my colleague Chris Matheson, but I think a sort of family show version would be that Chris said that some of the reporting of this was incorrect, shall we say.
Well, that's very diplomatic of you. Well, we'll leave it at that. Thank you for being diplomatic in your language. We're going to move on to a different story. Caroline, it is somewhat surprising, this story. It's causing waves in Westminster. Did you know that up until now, maternity leave for ministers has been an informal, discretionary arrangement?
Well, I think it shows us just how far behind our Parliament still is, that we're having to have emergency legislation to allow a female cabinet minister to take maternity leave. I think there are separate issues going on here, and I think it's really important. Suella Braverman would have to resign if she were not able to take maternity leave, if we don't make this change in the law. And to me, it's unthinkable in the 21st century that any woman would have to resign her job because she was pregnant.
Right.
So we do need to sort that. That's crucially important.
Well, let's just explain, just in case for people who don't know, you are talking about the Attorney General, Suella Braverman, who wants to go on to maternity leave. And it's now been discovered, as you were saying, that particularly in the case of a law officer, like an Attorney General, that they can't actually do it straightforwardly, slightly different to other cabinet ministers. Here's the ministerial code. Ministers who wish to take maternity leave of up to 6 months must seek the permission of the Prime Minister. So, yes, sorry, I interrupted. Carry on. A, surprised that we didn't know about it, and B, what's being done about it?
Well, a piece of emergency legislation, it's right that we bring that forward, but I hope that this triggers a much wider debate, because my committee is about to publish a report on the gendered economic impact of COVID, and we took a lot of evidence from organisations representing pregnant women about the impact of COVID on them. I'm also very acutely aware that this is about maternity leave for a female pregnant cabinet minister. I think we need to be having a much wider debate about parental leave, about leave for parents who are adopting children. And I think this is a good start, that we can have a conversation, get a quick piece of legislation, hopefully on the statute book, to remove the discrimination in that particular case. But for me, this is about a much wider issue. We need to be discussing parental rights, and we need to be looking at it in the round, not just for cabinet ministers.
Alison?
This is one of those things that you wake up and hear about in the morning and think, I cannot believe we've not sorted this already.
And it's been going on, but obviously it's been in place, hasn't it, forever?
Yeah, exactly. And this is one of those things where it makes the point that the history of our country and of our politics does still have an impact today, which is, relevant, obviously, to what we're talking about. Obviously, we've got to get this boxed and sorted. There is a suite of other things probably in and around politics that need to change as well. I would, from what Caroline's saying, I think the Select Committee's report probably sounds quite important, and I shall read it with interest.
Right. Will it allow this legislation, Caroline, for shared parental leave, for paternity leave?
So I've not seen the draft bill. Apologies for that. I had a good briefing from Penny Mordaunt, who's introducing it at the start of the week, and it's my understanding that this is just for maternity leave for cabinet ministers. I could be wrong, and apologies if I am. But I think that there are wider conversations about parental leave, about adoption leave.
Well, will you be pushing for it in this instance?
OK, so I think what is important is that we get this piece of legislation on the statute book, but this certainly gives me the opportunity to speak in a debate next week where I will be airing a wide range of issues.
All right, Inaya?
Yes, I think it's really good that at least the government is responsive when these issues do arise. And I think it is unfortunate to see that in this day and age that there are still many gender-related issues that kind of come up. But thankfully, now that we've been aware of it, we can do something about it. And no woman or anybody that is having a child should necessarily have to lose their job for that reality. So hopefully, if anything like that comes up again, we can make sure that doesn't happen again.
Kahinda, did that surprise you?
Yes
or no?
I don't think we should ever be surprised to find out how inequality plays out. But I guess even that, it is shocking that in the 21st century that's the case. But again, you shouldn't really be surprised by any of this. And it is a reminder of the role in it.
All right, that's it. Thank you.